All right, let's dive right into this explainer and absolutely bust the biggest historical myth about the fall of the mighty Aztec Empire. For centuries, we've been spoon-fed this very specific story that a tiny, technologically advanced band of Spanish conquistadors arrived in the Americas, were mistaken for literal gods, and just single-handedly toppled a massive, thriving empire. But the historical record reveals something entirely different. The Aztec Empire wasn't murdered by an outside force. It was actually already fundamentally broken. Today, we're going to look at the real geopolitical, economic, and social systems that doomed the Aztecs long before the Spanish even set foot on their shores.
We're breaking this investigation down into 5 quick stages: rise of the underdogs, the expansion engine, an empire of fear, the Spanish spark, and finally, the inevitable collapse.
Section 1, Rise of the Underdogs. To really understand how they fell, we first have to look at how they miraculously went from wandering outcasts to absolute dominators.
They weren't always the top dogs, They literally had to adapt militarily just to survive. Picture this: centuries of wandering from a mythical homeland called Aztlan. By 1325, following a prophecy, they finally settled on a swampy island in Lake Texcoco after spotting an eagle devouring a snake on a cactus. But they were incredibly weak at this point. Throughout the late 1300s, they were heavily subjugated, forced to pay crushing taxes, and had to fight as vassal mercenaries for the much more powerful Azcapotzalco kingdom. That brutal environment is exactly what forced the Aztecs to evolve from a peaceful agricultural tribe into a highly militaristic society. And finally, in 1426, their warrior king Itzcoatl had enough. He led a massive, victorious war of independence, completely burning their former overlords to the ground. By teaming up to form the Triple Alliance with 2 other rebel cities, the Aztecs secured a massive 40% of all regional spoils of war. When you break it down, Tenochtitlan and Texcoco grabbed the lion's share at 40% each, leaving Tlacopan with 20%. But here's the kicker. Rather than governing their vast new territories directly, they adopted a super dangerous strategy. They ruled indirectly. Conquered cities could keep their own leaders and their own gods, provided they paid heavy biannual tribute and supplied soldiers. It was a cheap way to rule, sure, but it was backed entirely by the constant threat of the Aztec military.
Section 2, the expansion engine. Now we get to the core, completely unsustainable mechanism that drove their entire society. When you look at Aztec society, every single tier, from the bottom to the very top, demanded something that only constant war could provide. Warriors needed new lands to settle because, well, land is finite. Commoners, who were going through a massive population boom without the plagues of Europe slowing them down, needed staggering amounts of imported resources. The ruling nobles were growing corrupt and demanded ever-increasing wealth and control. And the priests, they were totally reactionary. As the military fought more wars, the priests demanded a constant, expanding supply of human sacrifices to appease the gods. They actually fueled this massive engine initially with chinampas. Think of these as brilliant, highly fertile floating gardens built right on the lakes. They could literally be harvested multiple times a year. But this created a major catch-22. These incredible agricultural yields drove explosive population growth in their capital. And as their population exploded, their demand for tribute, things like food, clothing, tools, from neighboring towns just skyrocketed.
So we end up with this incredibly dangerous positive feedback loop. The larger the empire grew, the more violently it had to expand just to keep from collapsing in on itself. And because they didn't have beasts of burden or the wheel for transport, every single ounce of this tribute had to be carried on human backs. So they had to conquer more land, to feed more people, to supply a larger army, to capture more sacrifices. It was just this endless, exhausting treadmill of conquest. Section 3, an empire of fear. This constant, relentless need for expansion turned the Aztecs into brutal overlords who managed their subjects through absolute terror. 80,400. That is the estimated number of human beings slaughtered in just 5 days for the completion of the Grand Temple in Tenochtitlan back in 1487. Now, modern historians suspect the Aztecs might have exaggerated that figure a bit as a form of psychological warfare, but even conservative estimates put the death toll in the tens of thousands. Vassal leaders were literally forced to attend and watch as lines of prisoners had their hearts extracted one by one continuously until the temple steps ran red with blood. It was a calculated, gruesome display of pure intimidation. To truly grasp why their subjects absolutely despised them, just consider the ritualistic horror of a sacrifice to the fire god. Step 1, the victim is drugged to numb them. Step 2, they're tied up tight. Step 3, and this is wild,
They are thrown directly into a roaring fire. And step 4, while they are crisped but literally still alive, they get pulled out just so the priests can rip their beating heart right out of their chest. Imagine being a neighboring tribe and knowing this is exactly what awaits your sons and brothers if you fail to pay your taxes.
Which naturally leads us to ask, when loyalty is enforced exclusively through extreme brutality, what happens the exact moment a viable alternative appears? I mean, if your whole empire is held together by the threat of having your heart ripped out on a pyramid, what do you think your subjects are going to do the very second they see an opportunity to fight back?
Section 4. The Spanish Spark. The answer to that question arrives in 1519, and not as some alien invasion of gods, but as the spark that blows up a powder keg.
We really need to separate the propaganda we've all been taught from the actual geopolitical reality of the invasion. The myth claims Moctezuma and his people just capitulated because they thought bearded white men were returning deities and that a few muskets easily won the day. But the reality? The Native Americans were not stupid. They knew exactly what the Spanish were: mortal, highly aggressive outsiders with some useful shiny armor and loud weapons. The native states didn't worship them. They used them as convenient, heavily armed tools to violently escape Aztec tyranny.
Because here is the crucial point. Hernán Cortés didn't conquer the Aztecs alone. He leveraged the boiling hatred of tens of thousands of oppressed native people who wanted out. He landed with only about 630 mostly unseasoned men, but he quickly met local tribes who were already desperate to rebel. He forged a massive alliance with the Tlaxcala Confederacy, a group that was surrounded, embargoed, and hunted by the Aztecs for human sacrifices. Given the choice between eventual extermination by the Aztecs or allying with these strange foreigners, the choice was obvious. They provided Cortés with an estimated 100,000-plus native warriors. This wasn't a Spanish conquest. It was a massive native-led indigenous rebellion with a Spanish vanguard.
Section 5. The Inevitable Collapse. With all these internal weaknesses suddenly exposed, the final descent into chaos was rapid and devastating.
Things unraveled fast. You had Emperor Moctezuma II's extreme paranoia. The guy was literally executing his own high priests for failing to predict a comet. You had the total alienation of previously loyal subjects, because the Aztecs just doubled down on their escalating brutality, which ironically drove more allies away. Then, the ultimate tragedy struck: smallpox. A disease the indigenous immune system had never encountered swept through the capital, wiping out tens of thousands. And finally, the Spanish and their massive native coalition laid an agonizing 8-month siege on Tenochtitlan, destroying the aqueducts and starving the city on its lake. The fatal flaw here was ruling indirectly but extracting wealth brutally. They left no centralized loyalty or unified culture to bind the empire together in a crisis. The Aztecs were essentially a sick dog before the Spanish even arrived, completely incapable of governing their vast territories in a sustainable way. Because they never bothered to build a shared identity, the empire just shattered along its fragile fault lines the second it faced real pressure.
Governments that rule through fear will eventually fall. I want to leave you with that stark reality today. The Aztec Empire was not murdered. It committed systemic suicide by relying entirely on fear. History shows us time and time again that if you build your power entirely on terror and extraction, you aren't building a lasting society. You're just waiting for the day your subjects find a sharp enough knife to cut you down. So what other mighty empires in history were actually just a house of cards waiting for a breeze? Think about that, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.